Chapter 35 of Bleak House. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Bleak House by Charles Dickens. Chapter 35. Esther's Narrative.
I lay ill through several weeks, and the usual tenor of my life became like an old remembrance. But this was not the effect of time so much as of the change in all my habits made by the helplessness and inaction of a sick-room. Before I had been confined to it many days, everything else seemed to have retired into a remote distance where there was little or no separation between the various stages of my life, which had been really divided by years. In falling ill, I seemed to have crossed a dark lake and to have left all my experiences mingled together by the great distance on the healthy shore. My housekeeping duties, though at first it caused me great anxiety to think that they were unperformed, were soon as far off as the oldest of the old duties at Greenleaf, or the summer afternoons when I went home from school with my portfolio under my arm and my childish shadow at my side to my godmother's house. I had never known before how short life really was, and into how small a space the mind could put it. While I was very ill, the way in which these divisions of time became confused with one another distressed my mind exceedingly. At once a child, an elder girl, and the little woman I had been so happy as, I was not only oppressed by cares and difficulties adapted to each station, but by the great perplexity of endlessly trying to reconcile them. I suppose that few who have not been in such a condition can quite understand what I mean, or what painful unrest arose from this source. For the same reason, I am almost afraid to hint at that time in my disorder. It seemed one long night, but I believe there were both nights and days in it, when I laboured up colossal staircases, ever striving to reach the top, and ever turned as I have seen a worm in a garden path by some obstruction, and labouring again. I knew perfectly at intervals, and I think vaguely at most times, that I was in my bed, and I talked with Charley and felt her touch, and knew her very well, yet I would find myself complaining, "Oh, more of these never-ending stairs, Charley, more and more, piled up to the sky, I think," and labouring on again. Dare I hint at that worst time when, strung together somewhere in great black space, there was a flaming necklace or ring or starry circle of some kind, of which I was one of the beads, and when my only prayer was to be taken off from the rest, and when it was such inexplicable agony and misery to be a part of the dreadful thing? Perhaps the less I say of these sick experiences, the less tedious and the more intelligible I shall be. I do not recall them to make others unhappy, or because I am now the least unhappy in remembering them. It may be that if we knew more of such strange afflictions, we might be the better able to alleviate their intensity. The repose that succeeded the long delicious sleep, the blissful rest, when in my weakness I was too calm to have any care for myself, and could have heard, or so I think now, that I was dying, with no other emotion than with a pitying love for those I left behind, this state can be perhaps more widely understood. I was in this state when I first shrunk from the light as it twinkled on me once more, and knew with a boundless joy for which no words are rapturous enough that I should see again. I had heard my Ada crying at the door day and night. I had heard her calling to me that I was cruel and did not love her. I had heard her praying and imploring to be let in, to nurse and comfort me, and to leave my bedside no more. But I had only said, when I could speak, "Never, my sweet girl, never!" And I had over and over again reminded Charley that she was to keep my darling from the room, whether I lived or died. Charley had been true to me in that time of need, and with her little hand and her great heart had kept the door fast. But now, my sight strengthening and the glorious light coming every day more fully and brightly on me, I could read the letters that my dear wrote to me every morning and evening, and could put them to my lips and lay my cheek upon them with no fear of hurting her. I could see my little maid, so tender and so careful, going about the 2 rooms setting everything in order and speaking cheerfully to Ada from the open window again. I could understand the stillness in the house and the thoughtfulness it expressed on the part of all those who had always been so good to me. I could weep in the exquisite felicity of my heart and be as happy in my weakness as ever I had been in my strength. By and by my strength began to be restored. Instead of lying, with so strange a calmness, watching what was done for me as if it were done for some one else whom I was quietly sorry for, I helped it a little, and so on to a little more, and much more, until I became useful to myself, and interested, and attached to life again. How well I remember the pleasant afternoon when I was raised in bed with pillows for the first time to enjoy a great tea-drinking with Charley. The little creature, sent into the world surely to minister to the weak and sick, was so happy and so busy and stopped so often in her preparations to lay her head upon my bosom and fondle me and cry with joyful tears she was so glad, that I was obliged to say, "Charley, if you go on in this way, I must lie down again, my darling, for I am weaker than I thought I was." So Charley became as quiet as a mouse and took her bright face here and there, across and across the 2 rooms, out of the shade into the divine sunshine, and out of the sunshine into the shade, while I watched her peacefully. When all her preparations were concluded, and the pretty tea-table with its little delicacies to tempt me, and its white cloth, and its flowers, and everything so lovingly and beautifully arranged for me by Ada downstairs, was ready at the bedside, I felt sure I was steady enough to say something to Charley that was not new to my thoughts. First I complimented Charley on the room, and indeed it was so fresh and airy, so spotless and neat, that I could scarcely believe I had been lying there so long. This delighted Charley, and her face was brighter than before. "Yet, Charley," said I, looking round, "I miss something, surely, that I am accustomed to." Poor little Charley looked round too and pretended to shake her head as if there were nothing absent. "Are the pictures all as they used to be?" I asked her. "Every one of them, miss," said Charley. "And the furniture, Charley?" "Except where I've moved it about to make more room, miss." "And yet," said I miss some familiar object. Ah, I know what it is, Charley. It's the looking-glass." Charley got up from the table, making as if she had forgotten something, and went into the next room, and I heard her sob there. I had thought of this very often. I was now certain of it. I could thank God that it was not a shock to me now. I called Charley back, and when she came, at first pretending to smile, but as she drew nearer to me, looking grieved, I took her in my arms and said, "It matters very little, Charley. I hope I can do without my old face very well." I was presently so far advanced as to be able to sit up in a great chair, and even giddily to walk into the adjoining room, leaning on Charley. The mirror was gone from its usual place in that room too, but what I had to bear was none the harder to bear for that. My guardian had throughout been earnest to visit me, and there was now no good reason why I should deny myself that happiness. He came one morning, and when he first came in, could only hold me in his embrace and say, "My dear, dear girl!" I had long known, who could know better, what a deep fountain of affection and generosity his heart was, and was it not worth my trivial suffering and change to fill such a place in it? Oh, yes, I thought, he has seen me, and he loves me better than he did. He has seen me, and is even fonder of me than he was before. And what have I to mourn for? He sat down by me on the sofa, supporting me with his arm. For a little while he sat with his hand over his face, but when he removed it, fell into his usual manner. There never can have been, there never can be, a pleasanter manner.
"My little woman,"
said he,
"what a sad time this has been! Such an inflexible little woman, too, through all."
"Only for the best, guardian," said I.
"For the best,"
he repeated tenderly.
"Of course, for the best. But here have Ada and I been perfectly forlorn and miserable. Here has your friend Caddy been coming and going late and early. Here has every one about the house been utterly lost and dejected. Here has even poor Rick been writing to me, too, in his anxiety for you."
I had read of Caddy and Ada's letters, but not of Richard. I told him so.
"Why, no, my dear,"
he replied.
"I have thought it better not to mention it to her."
"And you speak of his writing to you?" said I, repeating his emphasis. "As if it were not natural for him to do so, guardian. As if he could write to a better friend."
"He thinks he could, my love,"
returned my guardian,
"and to many a better. The truth is, he wrote to me under a sort of protest, while unable to write to you with any hope of an answer. Wrote coldly, haughtily, distantly, resentfully. Well, dearest little woman, we must look forbearingly on it. He is not to blame. Jarndyce and Jarndyce has warped him out of himself and perverted me in his eyes. I have known it do as bad deeds and worse many a time. If two angels could be concerned in it, I believe it would change their nature."
"It has not changed yours, guardian."
"Oh, yes, it has, my dear,"
he said laughingly.
"It has made the south wind easterly, I don't know how often. Rick mistrusts and suspects me, goes to lawyers, and is taught to mistrust and suspect me. Hears I have conflicting interests, claims clashing against his, and what not. Whereas heaven knows that if I could get out of the mountains of wiglomeration on which my unfortunate name has been so long bestowed, which I can't, or could level them by the extinction of my own original right, which I can't either, and no human power ever can anyhow, I believe, to such a pass have we got, I would do it this hour. I would rather restore to poor Rick his proper nature than be endowed with all the money that dead suitors, broken heart and soul upon the wheel of Chancery, have left unclaimed with the Accountant General. And that's money enough, my dear, to be cast into a pyramid in memory of Chancery's transcendent wickedness."
"Is it possible, guardian," I asked, amazed, "that Richard can be suspicious of you?"
"Ah, my love," he said, "it is in the subtle poison of such abuses to breed such diseases. His blood is infected, and objects lose their natural aspects in his sight. It is not his fault."
"But it is a terrible misfortune, guardian."
"It is a terrible misfortune, little woman, to be ever drawn within the influences of Jarndyce and Jarndyce. I know none greater. By little and little he has been induced to trust in that rotten reed, and it communicates some portion of its rottenness to everything around him. But again I say with all my soul, we must be patient with poor Rick and not blame him. What a troop of fine fresh hearts like this have I seen in my time, turned by the same means!" I could not help expressing something of my wonder and regret that his benevolent, disinterested intentions had prospered so little. "We must not say so, Dame Durden,"
he cheerfully replied.
Ada is the happier, I hope, and that is much. I did think that I and both these young creatures might be friends instead of distrustful foes, and that we might so far counteract the suit and prove too strong for it. But it was too much to expect. Jarndyce and Jarndyce was the curtain of Rick's cradle.
But, guardian, may we not hope that a little experience will teach him what a false and wretched thing it is?
We will hope so, my Esther,
said Mr. Jarndyce,
and that it may not teach him so too late. In any case, we must not be hard on him. There are not many grown and matured men living while we speak, good men too, who, if they were thrown into this same court as suitors, would not be vitally changed and depreciated within 3 years, within 2, within 1. How can we stand amazed at poor Rick? A young man so unfortunate.
Here he fell into a lower tone, as if he were thinking aloud.
Cannot at first believe, who could, that Chancery is what it is. He looks to it, flushed and fitfully, to do something with his interests and bring them to some settlement. It procrastinates, disappoints, tries, tortures him, wears out his sanguine hopes and patience, thread by thread, but he still looks to it, and hankers after it, and finds his whole world treacherous and hollow. Well, well, well. Enough of this, my dear.
He had supported me, as at first, all this time, and his tenderness was so precious to me that I leaned my head upon his shoulder and loved him as if he had been my father. I resolved in my own mind, in this little pause, by some means, to see Richard when I grew strong and try to set him right.
There are better subjects than these, said my guardian, for such a joyful time was the time of our dear girl's recovery, and I had a commission to broach one of them as soon as I should begin to talk. When shall Ada come to see you, my love?
I had been thinking of that too, a little in connexion with the absent mirrors, but not much, for I knew my loving girl would be changed by no change in my looks. Dear guardian, said I, as I have shut her out so long, though indeed she is like the light to me.
I know it well, Dame Durden, well.
He was so good. His touch expressed such endearing compassion and affection, and the tone of his voice carried such comfort into my heart that I stopped for a little while, quite unable to go on.
Yes, yes, you are tired,
said he.
Rest a little.
As I have kept Ada out so long, I began afresh after a short while, I think I should like to have my own way a little longer, guardian. It would be best to be away from here before I see her. If Charley and I were to go to some country lodging as soon as I can move, and if I had a week there in which to grow stronger and to be revived by the sweet air and to look forward to the happiness of having Ada with me again, I think it would be better for us. I hope it was not a poor thing in me to wish to be a little more used to my altered self before I met the eyes of the dear girl I longed so ardently to see, but it is the truth. I did. He understood me, I was sure, but I was not afraid of that. If it were a poor thing, I knew he would pass it over.
"Ah, spoilt little woman,"
said my guardian,
"shall have her own way even in her inflexibility, though at the price, I know, of tears downstairs. And see here. Here is Boythorn, heart of chivalry, breathing such ferocious vows as never were breathed on paper before, that if you don't go and occupy his whole house, he having already turned out of it expressly for that purpose, by heaven and by earth he'll pull it down and not leave one brick standing on another."
And my guardian put a letter in my hand, without any ordinary beginning such as "My dear Jarndyce," but rushing at once into the words, I swear if Miss Summerson do not come down and take possession of my house, which I vacate for her this day at 1 o'clock p.m." And then with the utmost seriousness and in the most emphatic terms, going on to make the extraordinary declaration he had quoted. We did not appreciate the right of the less for laughing heartily over it, and we settled that I should send him a letter of thanks on the morrow and accept his offer. It was a most agreeable one to me, for all the places I could have thought of, I should have liked to go to none so well as Chesney Wold.
"Now, little housewife," said my guardian, looking at his watch, "I was strictly timed before I came upstairs, for you must not be tired too soon, and my time has waned away to the last minute. I have one other petition. Little Miss Flite, hearing a rumour that you were ill, made nothing of walking down here, 20 miles, poor soul, in a pair of dancing shoes, to inquire. It was heaven's mercy we were at home, or she would have walked back again."
The old conspiracy to make me happy. Everybody seemed to be in it.
"Now, pet," said my guardian, "if it would not be irksome to you to admit the harmless little creature one afternoon before you save Boythorn's otherwise devoted house from demolition, I believe you would make her prouder and better pleased with herself than I, though my eminent name is Jarndyce, could do in a lifetime." I have no doubt he knew there would be something in the simple image of the poor afflicted creature that would fall like a gentle lesson on my mind at that time. I felt it as he spoke to me. I could not tell him heartily enough how ready I was to receive her. I had always pitied her, never so much as now. I had always been glad of my little power to soothe her under her calamity, but never, never half so glad before. We arranged a time for Miss Flite to come out by the coach and share my early dinner. When my guardian left me, I turned my face away upon my couch and prayed to be forgiven if I, surrounded by such blessings, had magnified to myself the little trial that I had to undergo. The childish prayer of that old birthday, when I had aspired to be industrious, contented, and true-hearted, and to do good to some one and win some love to myself if I could, came back into my mind with a reproachful sense of all the happiness I had since enjoyed and all the affectionate hearts that had been turned towards me. If I were weak now, what had I profited by those mercies? I repeated the old childish prayer in its old childish words and found that its old peace had not departed from it. My guardian now came every day. In a week or so more I could walk about our rooms and hold long talks with Ada from behind the window curtain. Yet I never saw her, for I had not as yet the courage to look at the dear face, though I could have done so easily without her seeing me. On the appointed day Miss Flite arrived. The poor little creature ran into my room, quite forgetful of her usual dignity, and crying from her very heart of hearts, "My dear Fitz Jarndyce!" fell upon my neck and kissed me 20 times. "Dear me," said she, putting her hand into her reticule, "I have nothing here but documents, my dear Fitz Jarndyce. I must borrow a pocket-handkerchief." Charley gave her one, and the good creature certainly made use of it, for she held it to her eyes with both hands and sat so, shedding tears for the next 10 minutes. "With pleasure, my dear Fitz Jarndyce," she was careful to explain. "Not the least pain. Pleasure to see you well again. Pleasure at having the honour of being admitted to see you. I am so much fonder of you, my love, than of the Chancellor, though I do attend court regularly. By the by, my dear, mentioning pocket-handkerchiefs." Miss Flite here looked at Charley, who had been to meet her at the place where the coach stopped. Charley glanced at me and looked unwilling to pursue the suggestion. "Very right," said Miss Flite. "Very correct, truly. Highly indiscreet of me to mention it.
But, my dear Miss Jarndyce, I'm afraid I am at times, between ourselves you wouldn't think it, a little rambling, you know," said Miss Flite, touching her forehead. "Nothing more."
"What were you going to tell me?" said I, smiling, for I saw she wanted to go on. "You have roused my curiosity, and now you must gratify it." Miss Flite looked at Charley for advice in this important crisis, who said,
"If you please, ma'am, you'd better tell then,"
and therein gratified Miss Flite beyond measure.
"So sagacious, our young friend,"
said she to me in her mysterious way.
"Diminutive, but very sagacious. Well, my dear, it's a pretty anecdote, nothing more. Still, I think it charming. Who should follow us down the road from the coach, my dear, but a poor person in a very ungenteel bonnet?"
"Jenny, if you please, miss," said Charley.
"Just so,"
Miss Flite acquiesced with the greatest suavity.
"Jenny. Yes. And what does she tell our young friend but there has been a lady with a veil inquiring at her cottage after my dear Fitz Jarndyce's health, and taking a handkerchief away with her as a little keepsake merely because it was my amiable Fitz Jarndyce's. Now, you know, so very prepossessing in the lady with the veil."
"If you please, miss," said Charley, to whom I looked in some astonishment, "Jenny says that when her baby died you left a handkerchief there and that you put it away and kept it with the baby's little things. I think, if you please, partly because it was yours, miss, and partly because it had covered the baby."
"Diminutive,"
whispered Miss Flite, making a variety of motions about her own forehead to express intellect in Charley.
"But exceedingly sagacious. And so, dear, my love, she's clearer than any counsel I ever heard."
"Yes, Charley," I returned, "I remember it. Well?"
"Well, miss," said Charley, "and that's the handkerchief the lady took. And Jenny wants you to know that she wouldn't have made away with it herself for a heap of money, but that the lady took it and left some money instead. Jenny don't know her at all, if you please, miss."
"Why, who can she be?" said I.
"My love,"
Miss Flite suggested, advancing her lips to my ear with her most mysterious look,
"in my opinion, don't mention this to our diminutive friend, she's the Lord Chancellor's wife. He's married, you know, and I understand she leads him a terrible life. Throws his lordship's papers into the fire, my dear, if he won't pay the jeweller."
I did not think very much about this lady then, for I had an impression that it might be Caddy. Besides, my attention was diverted by my visitor, who was cold after her ride and looked hungry, and who, our dinner being brought in, required some little assistance in arraying herself with great satisfaction in a pitiable old scarf and a much-worn and often mended pair of gloves, which she had brought down in a paper parcel. I had to preside, too, over the entertainment, consisting of a dish of fish, a roast fowl, a sweetbread, vegetables, pudding, and Madeira, and it was so pleasant to see how she enjoyed it, and with what state and ceremony she did honour to it, that I was soon thinking of nothing else. When we had finished and had our little dessert before us, embellished by the hands of my dear, who would yield the superintendence of everything, prepared for me to no one, Miss Flite was so very chatty and happy that I thought I would lead her to her own history. As she was always pleased to talk about herself, I began by saying, "You have attended on the Lord Chancellor many years, Miss Flite."
"Oh, many, many, many years, my dear, but I expect a judgment shortly."
There was an anxiety, even in her hopefulness, that made me doubtful if I had done right in approaching the subject. I thought I would say no more about it.
"My father expected a judgment," said Miss Flite. "My brother my sister. They all expected a judgment, the same that I expect." "They are all—" "Yes, dead, of course, my dear," said she. As I saw she would go on, I thought it best to try to be serviceable to her by meeting the theme rather than avoiding it. "Would it not be wiser," said I, "to expect this judgment no more?" "Why, my dear," she answered promptly, "of course it would." "And to attend the court no more?" "Equally, of course," said she. "Very wearing to be always in expectation of what never comes, my dear Fitz Jarndyce. Wearing, I assure you, to the bone." She slightly showed me her arm, and it was fearfully thin indeed. "But, my dear," she went on in her mysterious way, "there's a dreadful attraction in the place. Shh! Don't mention it to our diminutive friend when she comes in, or it may frighten her. With good reason. There's a cruel attraction in the place. You can't leave it, and you must expect." I tried to assure her that it was not so. She heard me patiently and smilingly, but was ready with her own answer. "Ay, ay, ay! You think so because I'm a little rambling. Very absurd to be a little rambling, is it not? Very confusing, too, to the head. I find it so. But, my dear, I have been there many years, and I have noticed. It's the mace and seal upon the table." What could they do, did she think? I mildly asked her. "Draw," returned Miss Flite. "Draw people on, my dear. Draw peace out of them, sense out of them, good looks out of them, good qualities out of them. I have felt them even drawing my rest away in the night. Cold and glittering devils." She tapped me several times upon the arm and nodded good-humouredly, as if she were anxious I should understand that I had no cause to fear her, though she spoke so gloomily and confided these awful secrets to me. "Let me see," said she. "I'll tell you my own case. Before they ever drew me, before I had ever seen them, what was it I used to do? Tambourine playing? No, tambour work. I and my sister worked at tambour work. Our father and our brother had a builder's business. We all lived together. Very respectably, my dear. First, our father was drawn, slowly. Home was drawn with him. In a few years he was a fierce, sour, angry bankrupt without a kind word or a kind look for any one. He had been so different, Fitz Jarndyce. He was drawn to a debtor's prison. There he died. Then our brother was drawn, swiftly, to drunkenness and rags and death. And my sister was drawn, never ask to what. Then I was ill and in misery, and heard, as I had often heard before, that this was all the work of Chancery. When I got better, I went to look at the monster, and then I found out how it was, and I was drawn to stay there." Having got over her own short narrative, in the delivery of which she had spoken in a low, strained voice, as if the shock were fresh upon her, she gradually resumed her usual air of amiable importance. "You don't quite credit me, my dear. Well, well, you will some day. I am a little rambling, but I have noticed. I've seen many new faces come, unsuspicious, within the influence of the mace and seal in these many years. As my fathers came there, as my brothers, as my sisters, as my own, I hear Conversation Kenge and the rest of them say to the new faces, 'Here's little Miss Flite. Oh, you are new here, and you must come and be presented to little Miss Flite. Very good. Proud, I am sure, to have the honour, and we all laugh. But, Fitz Jarndyce, I know what will happen. I know far better than they do when the attraction has begun. I know the signs, my dear. I saw them begin in Gridley, and I saw them end. Fitz Jarndyce, my love," speaking low again, "I saw them beginning in our friend, the warden Jarndyce. Let some one hold him back, or he'll be drawn to ruin." She looked at me in silence for some moments, with her face gradually softening into a smile. Seeming to fear that she had been too gloomy, and seeming also to lose the connexion in her mind, she said politely, as she sipped her glass of wine, "Yes, my dear, as I was saying, I expect a judgment shortly. Then I shall release my birds, you know, and confer estates." I was much impressed by her allusion to Richard, and by the sad meaning, so sadly illustrated in her poor pinched form, that made its way through all her incoherence. But happily for her, she was quite complacent again now, and beamed with nods and smiles. "Oh, but, my dear," she said gaily, reaching another hand to put it upon mine, "you have not congratulated me on my physician. Positively not once yet." I was obliged to confess that I did not quite know what she meant. "My physician, Mr. Woodcourt, my dear, who was so exceedingly attentive to me, though his services were rendered quite gratuitously until the day of judgment. I mean the judgment that will dissolve the spell upon me of the mace and seal." "Mr. Woodcourt is so far away now," said I, "that I thought the time for such congratulation was past, Miss Flite." "But, my child," she returned, "is it possible that you don't know what has happened?" "No," said I. "Not what everybody has been talking of, my beloved Fitz Jarndyce?" "No," said I. "You forget how long I've been here." "True, my dear, for the moment, true. I blame myself. But my memory has been drawn out of me, with everything else, by what I mentioned. Very strong influence, is it not? Well, my dear, there has been a terrible shipwreck over in those East Indian seas." "Mr. Woodcourt shipwrecked?" "Don't be agitated, my dear. He is safe. An awful scene. Death in all shapes. Hundreds of dead and dying. Fire, storm, and darkness. Numbers of the drowning thrown upon a rock. There, and through it all, my dear physician was a hero. Calm and brave through everything. Saved many lives. Never complained in hunger and thirst. Wrapped naked people in his spare clothes. Took the lead. Showed them what to do. Governed them. Tended the sick. Buried the dead. And brought the poor survivors safely off at last. My dear, the poor emaciated creatures all but worshipped him. They fell down at his feet when they got to the land and blessed him. The whole country rings with it. Stay! Where's my bag of documents? I have got it there, and you shall read it. You shall read it." And I did read all the noble history, though very slowly and imperfectly then, for my eyes were so dimmed that I could not see the words, and I cried so much that I was many times obliged to lay down the long account she had cut out of the newspaper. I felt so triumphant ever to have known the man who had done such generous and gallant deeds. I felt such glowing exultation in his renown. I so admired and loved what he had done that I envied the storm-worn people who had fallen at his feet and blessed him as their preserver. I could myself have kneeled down then, so far away, and blessed him in my rapture that he should be so truly good and brave. I felt that no one, mother, sister, wife, could honour him more than I. I did, indeed. My poor little visitor made me a present of the account, and when, as the evening began to close in, she rose to take her leave, lest she should miss the coach by which she was to return, She was still full of the shipwreck, which I had not yet sufficiently composed myself to understand in all its details. "My dear," said she as she carefully folded up her scarf and gloves, "my brave physician ought to have a title bestowed upon him, and no doubt he will. You are of that opinion?" That he well deserved one, yes. That he would ever have one, no. "Why not, Fitz Jarndyce?" she asked rather sharply. I said it was not the custom in England to confer titles on men distinguished by peaceful services, however good and great, unless occasionally when they consisted of the accumulation of some very large amount of money. "Why, good gracious!" said Miss Flite. "How can you say that? Surely you know, my dear, that all the greatest ornaments of England in knowledge, imagination, active humanity, and improvement of every sort are added to its nobility. Look round you, my dear, and consider. You must be rambling a little now, I think, if you don't know that this is the great reason why titles will always last in the land." I am afraid she believed what she said, for there were moments when she was very mad indeed. And now I must part with the little secret I have thus far tried to keep. I had thought sometimes that Mr. Woodcourt loved me, and that if he had been richer he would perhaps have told me that he loved me before he went away. I had thought sometimes that if he had done so I should have been glad of it. But how much better it was now that this had never happened! What should I have suffered if I had had to write to him and tell him that the poor face he had known as mine was quite gone from me, and that I freely released him from his bondage to one whom he had never seen? Oh, it was so much better as it was! With a great pang mercifully spared me, I could take back to my heart my childish prayer to be all he had so brightly shown himself, and there was nothing to be undone, no chain for me to break or for him to drag, and I could go, please God, my lowly way along the path of duty, and he could go his nobler way upon its broader road, and though we were apart upon the journey, I might aspire to meet him, unselfishly, innocently, better far than he had thought me when I found some favour in his eyes at the journey's end.
End of chapter 35. Of Bleak House. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Bleak House by Charles Dickens. Chapter 36. Chesney Wold. Charley and I did not set off alone upon our expedition into Lincolnshire. My guardian had made up his mind not to lose sight of me until I was safe in Mr. Boythorn's house. So he accompanied us, and we were 2 days upon the road. I found every breath of air, and every scent, and every flower and leaf and blade of grass, and every passing cloud, and everything in nature, more beautiful and wonderful to me than I had ever found it yet. This was my first gain from my illness. How little I had lost, when the wide world was so full of delight for me! My guardian intending to go back immediately, we appointed, on our way down, a day when my dear girl should come. I wrote her a letter of which he took charge, and he left us within half an hour of our arrival at our destination, on a delightful evening in the early summer time. If a good fairy had built the house for me with a wave of her wand, and I had been a princess and her favoured godchild, I could not have been more considered in it. So many preparations were made for me, and such an endearing remembrance was shown of all my little tastes and likings, that I could have sat down, overcome, a dozen times before I had revisited half the rooms. I did better than that, however, by showing them all to Charley instead. Charley's delight calmed mine, and after we had had a walk in the garden, and Charley had exhausted her whole vocabulary of admiring expressions,
I was as tranquilly happy as I ought to have been. It was a great comfort to be able to say to myself after tea, "Esther, my dear, I think you are quite sensible enough to sit down now and write a note of thanks to your host." He had left a note of welcome for me, as sunny as his own face, and had confided his bird to my care, which I knew to be his highest mark of confidence. Accordingly, I wrote a little note to him in London, telling him how all his favourite plants and trees were looking, and how the most astonishing of birds had chirped the honours of the house to me in the most hospitable manner, and how, after singing on my shoulder, to the inconceivable rapture of my little maid, he was then at roost in the usual corner of his cage, but whether dreaming or no, I could not report. My note finished and sent off to the post, I made myself very busy in unpacking and arranging, and I sent Charley to bed in good time and told her I should want her no more that night. For I had not yet looked in the glass and had never asked to have my own restored to me. I knew this to be a weakness which must be overcome, but I had always said to myself that I would begin afresh when I got to where I now was. Therefore I had wanted to be alone, and therefore I said, "Now alone in my own room, Esther, if you are to be happy, if you are to have any right to pray, to be true-hearted, you must keep your word, my dear." I was quite resolved to keep it, but I sat down for a little while first to reflect upon all my blessings, and then I said my prayers and thought a little more. My hair had not been cut off, though it had been in danger more than once. It was long and thick. I let it down, and shook it out, and went up to the glass upon the dressing-table. There was a little muslin curtain drawn across it. I drew it back and stood for a moment looking through such a veil of my own hair that I could see nothing else. Then I put my hair aside and looked at the reflection in the mirror, encouraged by seeing how placidly it looked at me. I was very much changed. Oh, very, very much. At first my face was so strange to me that I think I should have put my hands before it and started back but for the encouragement I have mentioned. Very soon it became more familiar, and then I knew the extent of the alteration in it better than I had done at first. It was not like what I had expected, but I had expected nothing definite, and I dare say anything definite would have surprised me. I had never been a beauty and had never thought myself one, but I had been very different from this. It was all gone now. Heaven was so good to me that I could let it go with a few not bitter tears and could stand there arranging my hair for the night quite thankfully. One thing troubled me, and I considered it for a long time before I went to sleep. I had kept Mr. Woodcourt's flowers. When they were withered, I had dried them and put them in a book that I was fond of. Nobody knew this, not even Ada. I was doubtful whether I had a right to preserve what he had sent to one so different, whether it was generous towards him to do it. I wished to be generous to him, even in the secret depths of my heart, which he would never know, because I could have loved him, could have been devoted to him. At last I came to the conclusion that I might keep them, if I treasured them, only as a remembrance of what was irrevocably past and gone, never to be looked back on any more in any other light. I hope this may not seem trivial. I was very much in earnest. I took care to be up early in the morning and to be before the glass when Charley came in on tiptoe. "Dear, dear miss!" cried Charley, starting. "Is that you?" "Yes, Charley," said I, quietly putting up my hair, "and I am very well indeed, and very happy." I saw it was a weight off Charley's mind, but it was a greater weight off mine. I knew the worst now and was composed to it. I shall not conceal, as I go on, the weaknesses I could not quite conquer, but they always passed from me soon, and a happier frame of mind stayed by me faithfully. Wishing to be fully re-established in my strength and in my good spirits before Ada came, I now laid down a little series of plans with Charley for being in the fresh air all day long. We were to be out before breakfast, and were to dine early, and were to be out again before and after dinner, and were to talk in the garden after tea, and were to go to rest betimes, and were to climb every hill and explore every road, lane, and field in the neighbourhood. As to restoratives and strengthening delicacies, Mr. Boythorn's good housekeeper was for ever trotting about with something to eat or drink in her hand. I could not even be heard of as resting in the park, but she would come trotting after me with a basket, her cheerful face shining with a lecture on the importance of frequent nourishment. Then there was a pony expressly for my riding, a chubby pony with a short neck and a mane all over his eyes, who could canter, when he would, so easily and quietly that he was a treasure. In a very few days he would come to me in the paddock when I called him, and eat out of my hand, and follow me about. We arrived at such a capital understanding that when he was jogging with me lazily and rather obstinately down some shady lane, if I patted his neck and said, "Stubbs, I'm surprised you don't canter when you know how much I like it, and I think you might oblige me, for you're only getting stupid and going to sleep," he would give his head a comical shake or two and set off directly, while Charley would stand still and laugh with such enjoyment that her laughter was like music. I don't know who had given Stubbs his name, but it seemed to belong to him as naturally as his rough coat. Once we put him in a little chaise and drove him triumphantly through the green lanes for 5 miles, but all at once, as we were extolling him to the skies, he seemed to take it ill that he should have been accompanied so far by the circle of tantalizing little gnats that had been hovering around and round his ears the whole way without appearing to advance an inch, and stopped to think about it. I suppose he came to the decision that it was not to be borne, for he steadily refused to move until I gave the reins to Charley and got out and walked, when he followed me with a sturdy sort of good humour, putting his head under my arm and rubbing his ear against my sleeve. It was in vain for me to say, "Now, Stubbs, I feel quite sure from what I know of you that you will go on if I ride a little while," for the moment I left him he stood stock still again. Consequently, I was obliged to lead the way as before, and in this order we returned home, to the great delight of the village. Charley and I had reason to call it the most friendly of villages, I am sure, for in a week's time the people were so glad to see us go by, though ever so frequently in the course of a day, that there were faces of greeting in every cottage. I had known many of the grown people before, and almost all the children, but now the very steeple began to wear a familiar and affectionate look. Among my new friends was an old woman who lived in such a little thatched and whitewashed dwelling that when the outside shutter was turned up on its hinges it shut up the whole house front. This old lady had a grandson who was a sailor, and I wrote a letter to him for her and drew at the top of it the chimney-corner in which she had brought him up, and where his old stool yet occupied its old place. This was considered by the whole village the most wonderful achievement in the world, but when an answer came back all the way from Plymouth, in which he mentioned that he was going to take the picture all the way to America, and from America would write again, I got all the credit that ought to have been given to the post office, and was invested with the merit of the whole system. Thus, what with being so much in the air, playing with so many children, gossiping with so many people, sitting on invitation in so many cottages, going on with Charley's education, and writing long letters to Ada every day, I had scarcely any time to think about that little loss of mine, and was almost always cheerful. If I did think of it at odd moments, now and then, I had only to be busy and forget it. I felt it more than I had hoped I should once when a little child said, "Mother, why is the lady not a pretty lady now, like she used to be?" But when I found the child was not less fond of me and drew its soft hand over my face with a kind of pitying protection in its touch, that soon set me up again. There were many little occurrences which suggested to me, with great consolation, how natural it is to gentle hearts to be considerate and delicate towards any inferiority. One of these particularly touched me. I happened to stroll into the little church when a marriage was just concluded and the young couple had to sign the register. The bridegroom, to whom the pen was handed first, made a rude cross for his mark. The bride who came next did the same. Now, I had known the bride, when I was last there, not only as the prettiest girl in the place, but as having quite distinguished herself in the school, and I could not help looking at her with some surprise. She came aside and whispered to me, while tears of honest love and admiration stood in her bright eyes, "He's a dear good fellow, miss, but he can't write yet. He's going to learn of me, and I wouldn't shame him for the world." Why, what had I to fear, I thought, when there was this nobility in the soul of a labouring man's daughter? The air blew as freshly and revivingly upon me as it had ever blown, and the healthy colour came into my new face as it had come into my old one. Charley was wonderful to see. She was so radiant and so rosy, and we both enjoyed the whole day and slept soundly the whole night. There was a favourite spot of mine in the park woods of Chesney Wold, where a seat had been erected, commanding a lovely view. The wood had been cleared and opened to improve this point of sight, and the bright sunny landscape beyond was so beautiful that I rested there at least once every day. A picturesque part of the hall, called the Ghost's Walk, was seen to advantage from this higher ground, and the startling name and the old legend in the Dedlock family, which I had heard from Mr. Boythorn accounting for it, mingled with the view and gave it something of a mysterious interest in addition to its real charms. There was a bank here, too, which was a famous one for violets, and as it was a daily delight of Charley's to gather wild flowers, she took as much to the spot as I did. It would be idle to inquire now why I never went close to the house or never went inside it. The family were not there, I had heard on my arrival, and were not expected. I was far from being incurious or uninterested about the building. On the contrary, I often sat in this place wondering how the rooms ranged and whether any echo like a footstep really did resound at times, as the story said, upon the lonely Ghost's Walk. The indefinable feeling with which Lady Dedlock had impressed me may have had some influence in keeping me from the house even when she was absent. I am not sure. Her face and figure were associated with it naturally, but I cannot say that they repelled me from it, though something did. For whatever reason or no reason, I had never once gone near it, down to the day at which my story now arrives. I was resting at my favourite point after a long ramble, and Charley was gathering violets at a little distance from me. I had been looking at the Ghost's Walk, lying in a deep shade of masonry afar off, and picturing to myself the female shape that was said to haunt it, when I became aware of a figure approaching through the wood. The perspective was so long and so darkened by leaves, and the shadows of the branches on the ground made it so much more intricate to the eye, that at first I could not discern what figure it was. By little and little it revealed itself to be a woman's, a lady's, Lady Dedlock's. She was alone, and coming to where I sat with a much quicker step, I observed to my surprise, than was usual with her. I was fluttered by her being unexpectedly so near. She was almost within speaking distance before I knew her, and would have risen to continue my walk. But I could not. I was rendered motionless. Not so much by her hurried gesture of entreaty, not so much by her quick advance and outstretched hands, not so much by the great change in her manner and the absence of her haughty self-restraint, as by a something in her face that I had pined for and dreamed of when I was a little child, something I had never seen in any face, something I had never seen in hers before. A dread and faintness fell upon me, and I called to Charley. Lady Dedlock stopped upon the instant and changed back almost to what I had known her.
"Miss Summerson, I am afraid I have startled you,"
she said, now advancing slowly.
"You can scarcely be strong yet. You have been very ill, I know. I have been much concerned to hear it."
I could no more have removed my eyes from her pale face than I could have stirred from the bench on which I sat. She gave me her hand, and its deadly coldness, so at variance with the enforced composure of her features, deepened the fascination that overpowered me. I cannot say what was in my whirling thoughts.
"You are recovering again?"
she asked kindly. "I was quite well but a moment ago, Lady Dedlock."
"Is this your young attendant?"
"Yes."
"Will you send her on before and walk towards your house with me?"
"Charley," said I, "take your flowers home, and I will follow you directly." Charley, with her best curtsy, blushingly tied on her bonnet and went her way. When she was gone, Lady Dedlock sat down on the seat beside me. I cannot tell in any words what the state of my mind was when I saw in her hand my handkerchief with which I had covered the dead baby. I looked at her, but I could not see her. I could not hear her. I could not draw my breath. The beating of my heart was so violent and wild that I felt as if my life were breaking from me. But when she caught me to her breast, kissed me, wept over me, compassionated me, and called me back to myself, when she fell down on her knees and cried to me, "Oh, my child, my child, I am your wicked and unhappy mother. Oh, try to forgive me." When I saw her at my feet on the bare earth, in her great agony of mind, I felt, through all my tumult of emotion, a burst of gratitude to the providence of God that I was so changed as that I never could disgrace her by any trace of likeness, as that nobody could ever now look at me and look at her and remotely think of any near tie between us. I raised my mother up, praying and beseeching her not to stoop before me in such affliction and humiliation. I did so in broken, incoherent words, for besides the trouble I was in, it frightened me to see her at my feet. I told her, or I tried to tell her, that if it were for me, her child, under any circumstances, to take upon me to forgive her, I did it, and had done it many, many years ago. I told her that my heart overflowed with love for her, that it was natural love, which nothing in the past had changed or could change, that it was not for me, then resting for the first time on my mother's bosom, to take her to account for having given me life, but that my duty was to bless her and receive her, though the whole world turned from her, and that I only asked her leave to do it. I held my mother in my embrace, and she held me in hers, and among the still woods, in the silence of the summer day, there seemed to be nothing but our two troubled minds that was not at peace.
"To bless and receive me,"
groaned my mother.
"It is far too late. I must travel my dark road alone, and it will lead me where it will. From day to day, sometimes from hour to hour, I do not see the way before my guilty feet. This is the earthly punishment I have brought upon myself. I bear it, and I hide it."
Even in the thinking of her endurance, she drew her habitual air of proud indifference about her like a veil, though she soon cast it off again. "I must keep this secret, if by any means it can be kept, not wholly for myself. I have a husband, wretched and dishonouring creature that I am." These words she uttered with a suppressed cry of despair, more terrible in its sound than any shriek. Covering her face with her hands, she shrank down in my embrace, as if she were unwilling that I should touch her. Nor could I, by my utmost persuasions or by any endearments I could use, prevail upon her to rise. She said, no, 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 she could only speak to me so. She must be proud and disdainful everywhere else. She would be humbled and ashamed there in the only natural moments of her life. My unhappy mother told me that in my illness she had been nearly frantic. She had but then known that her child was living. She could not have suspected me to be that child before. She had followed me down here to speak to me but once in all her life. We never could associate, never could communicate, never, probably from that time forth, could interchange another word on earth. She put into my hands a letter she had written for my reading only, and said when I had read it and destroyed it, but not so much for her sake, since she asked nothing, as for her husband's and my own, I must evermore consider her as dead. If I could believe that she loved me in this agony in which I saw her, with a mother's love, she asked me to do that, for then I might think of her with a greater pity, imagining what she suffered. She had put herself beyond all hope and beyond all help. Whether she preserved her secret until death, or it came to be discovered, and she brought dishonour and disgrace upon the name she had taken, it was her solitary struggle always, and no affection could come near her, and no human creature could render her any aid. "But is the secret safe so far?" I asked. "Is it safe now, dearest mother?"
"No,"
replied my mother.
"It has been very near discovery. It was saved by an accident. It may be lost by another accident. To-morrow. Any day."
"Do you dread a particular person?"
"Shh! Do not tremble and cry so much for me. I am not worthy of these tears,"
said my mother, kissing my hands.
"I dread one person very much."
"An enemy?"
"Not a friend. One who is too passionless to be either. He is Sir Leicester Dedlock's lawyer, mechanically faithful without attachment, and very jealous of the profit, privilege, and reputation of being master of the mysteries of great houses."
"Has he any suspicions?"
"Many."
"Not of you?" I said, alarmed.
"Yes. He is always vigilant and always near me. I may keep him at a standstill, but I can never shake him off."
"Has he so little pity or compunction?"
"He has none, and no anger. He is indifferent to everything but his calling. His calling is the acquisition of secrets and the holding possession of such power as they give him, with no sharer or opponent in it."
"Could you trust in him?"
"I shall never try. The dark road I have trodden for so many years will end where it will. I follow it alone to the end, whatever the end be. It may be near, it may be distant. While the road lasts, nothing turns me."
"Dear mother, are you so resolved?"
"I am resolved. I have long outbidden folly with folly, pride with pride, scorn with scorn, insolence with insolence, and have outlived many vanities with many more. I will outlive this danger and outdie it if I can. It has closed around me almost as awfully as if these woods of Chesney Wold had closed around the house. But my course through it is the same. I have but one. I can have but one."
"Mr. Jarndyce," I was beginning when my mother hurriedly inquired,
"Does he suspect?"
"No," said I. "No, indeed. Be assured that he does not." And I told her what he had related to me as his knowledge of my story. "But he is so good and sensible," said I, "that perhaps if he knew—" My mother, who until this time had made no change in her position, raised her hand up to my lips and stopped me.
Confide fully in him," she said after a little while. "You have my free consent. A small gift from such a mother to her injured child. But do not tell me of it. Some pride is left in me even yet." I explained, as nearly as I could then or can recall now, for my agitation and distress throughout were so great that I scarcely understood myself, though every word that was uttered in the mother's voice, so unfamiliar and so melancholy to me, which in my childhood I had never learned to love and recognized, had never been sung to sleep with, had never heard a blessing from, had never had a hope inspired by, made an enduring impression on my memory. I say I explained, or tried to do it, how I had only hoped that Mr. Jarndyce, who had been the best of fathers to me, might be able to afford some counsel and support to her. But my mother answered no. It was impossible. No one could help her. Through the desert that lay before her, she must go alone. "My child, my child," she said, "for the last time. These kisses for the last time. These arms upon my neck for the last time. We shall meet no more. To hope to do what I seek to do, I must be what I have been so long. Such is my reward and doom. If you hear of Lady Dedlock, brilliant, prosperous, and flattered, think of your wretched mother, conscience-stricken underneath that mask. Think that the reality is in her suffering, in her useless remorse, in her murdering within her breast the only love and truth of which it is capable. And then forgive her if you can, and cry to heaven to forgive her, which it never can." We held one another for a little space yet, but she was so firm that she took my hands away and put them back against my breast, and with a last kiss as she held them there, released me and went from me into the wood. I was alone and calm and quiet. Below me in the sun and shade lay the old house, with its terraces and turrets, on which there had seemed to me to be such complete repose when I first saw it, but which now looked like the obdurate and unpitying watcher of my mother's misery. Stunned as I was, as weak and helpless at first as I had ever been in my sick chamber, the necessity of guarding against the danger of discovery, or even of the remotest suspicion, did me service. I took such precautions as I could to hide from Charley that I had been crying, and I constrained myself to think of every sacred obligation that there was upon me to be careful and collected. It was not a little while before I could succeed, or could even restrain bursts of grief. But after an hour or so, I was better and felt that I might return. I went home very slowly and told Charley, whom I found at the gate looking for me, that I had been tempted to extend my walk after Lady Dedlock had left me, and that I was overtired and would lie down. Safe in my own room, I read the letter. I clearly derived from it, and that was much then, that I had not been abandoned by my mother. Her elder and only sister, the godmother of my childhood, discovering signs of life in me when I had been laid aside as dead, had in her stern sense of duty, with no desire or willingness that I should live, reared me in rigid secrecy and had never again beheld my mother's face from within a few hours of my birth. So strangely did I hold my place in this world that until within a short time back I had never, to my own mother's knowledge, breathed, had been buried, had never been endowed with life, had never borne a name. When she had first seen me in the church, she had been startled and had thought of what would have been like me if it had ever lived and had lived on, but that was all then.
What more the letter told me needs not to be repeated here. It has its own times and places in my story. My first care was to burn what my mother had written and to consume even its ashes. I hope it may not appear very unnatural or bad in me that I then became heavily sorrowful to think I had ever been reared, that I felt as if I knew it would have been better and happier for many people if indeed I had never breathed, that I had a terror of myself as the danger and the possible disgrace of my own mother and of a proud family name, that I was so confused and shaken as to be possessed by a belief that it was right and had been intended that I should die in my birth, and that it was wrong and not intended that I should be then alive. These are the real feelings that I had. I fell asleep worn out, and when I awoke I cried afresh to think that I was back in the world with my load of trouble for others. I was more than ever frightened of myself, thinking anew of her against whom I was a witness, of the owner of Chesney Wold, of the new and terrible meaning of the old words, now moaning in my ear like a surge upon the shore. "Your mother, Esther, was your disgrace, and you are hers. The time will come, and soon enough, when you will understand this better and will feel it too, as no one save a woman can." With them these other words returned. "Pray daily that the sins of others be not visited upon your head." I could not disentangle all that was about me, and I felt as if the blame and the shame were all in me, and the visitation had come down. The day waned into a gloomy evening, overcast and sad, and I still contended with the same distress. I went out alone, and after walking a little in the park, watching the dark shades falling on the trees and the fitful flight of the bats, which sometimes almost touched me, was attracted to the house for the first time. Perhaps I might not have gone near it if I had been in a stronger frame of mind. As it was, I took the path that led close by it. I did not dare to linger or to look up, but I passed before the terrace garden with its fragrant odours, and its broad walks, and its well-kept beds and smooth turf, and I saw how beautiful and grave it was, and how the old stone balustrades and parapets, and wide flights of shallow steps, were seamed by time and weather, and how the trained moss and ivy grew about them, and around the old stone pedestal of the sun-dial, and I heard the fountain falling. Then away went by long lines of dark windows, diversified by turreted towers, and porches of eccentric shapes, where old stone lions and grotesque monsters bristled outside dens of shadow and snarled at the evening gloom over the escutcheons they held in their grip. Thence the path wound underneath a gateway and through a courtyard where the principal entrance was. I hurried quickly on, and by the stables where none but deep voices seemed to be, whether in the murmurings of the wind through the strong mass of ivy holding to a high red wall, or in the low complaining of the weathercock, or in the barking of the dogs, or in the slow striking of a clock. So, encountering presently a sweet smell of limes, whose rustling I could hear, I turned with the turning of the path to the south front, and there above me were the balustrades of the Ghost's Walk, and one lighted window that might be my mother's. The way was paved here like the terrace overhead, and my footsteps from being noiseless made an echoing sound upon the flags. Stopping to look at nothing, but seeing all I did see as I went, I was passing quickly on, and in a few moments should have passed the lighted window, when my echoing footsteps brought it suddenly into my mind that there was a dreadful truth in the legend of the Ghost's Walk, that it was I who was to bring calamity upon the stately house, and that my warning feet were haunting it even then. Seized with an augmented terror of myself which turned me cold, I ran from myself and everything, retraced the way by which I had come, and never paused until I gained the lodge gate and the park lay sullen and black behind me. Not before I was alone in my own room for the night and had again been dejected and unhappy there did I begin to know how wrong and thankless this state was. But from my darling who was coming on the morrow I found a joyful letter, full of such loving anticipation that I must have been of marble if it had not moved me. From my guardian, too, I found another letter, asking me to tell Dame Durden, if I should see that little woman anywhere, that they had moped most pitiably without her, that the housekeeping was going to wreck and ruin, that nobody else could manage the keys, and that everybody in and about the house declared it was not the same house and was becoming rebellious for her return. Two such letters together made me think how far beyond my deserts I was beloved and how happy I ought to be. That made me think of all my past life, and that brought me, as it ought to have done before, into a better condition. For I saw very well that I could not have been intended to die, or I should never have lived, not to say should never have been reserved for such a happy life. I saw very well how many things had worked together for my welfare, and that if the sins of the fathers were sometimes visited upon the children, the phrase did not mean what I had in the morning feared it meant. I knew I was as innocent of my birth as a queen of hers, and that before my heavenly Father I should not be punished for birth, nor a queen rewarded for it. I had had experience, in the shock of that very day, that I could, even thus soon, find comforting reconcilements to the chains that had fallen on me. I renewed my resolutions and prayed to be strengthened in them, pouring out my heart for myself and for my unhappy mother, and feeling that the darkness of the morning was passing away. It was not upon my sleep, and when the next day's light awoke me, it was gone. My dear girl was to arrive at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. How to help myself through the intermediate time better than by taking a long walk along the road by which she was to come, I did not know. So Charley and I and Stubbs saddled, for we never drove him after the one great occasion, made a long expedition along that road and back. On our return we held a great review of the house and garden, and saw that everything was in its prettiest condition, and had the bird out ready as an important part of the establishment. There were more than 2 full hours yet to elapse before she could come, and in that interval, which seemed a long one, I must confess I was nervously anxious about my altered looks. I loved my darling so well that I was more concerned for their effect on her than on any one. I was not in this slight distress because I had at all repined. I am quite certain that I did not that day. But I thought, would she be wholly prepared? When she first saw me, might she not be a little shocked and disappointed? Might it not prove a little worse than she expected? Might she not look for her old Esther and not find her? Might she not have to grow used to me and begin all over again? I knew the various expressions of my sweet girl's face so well, and it was such an honest face in its loveliness, that I was sure beforehand she could not hide that first look from me. And I considered whether, if it should signify any one of these meanings, which was so very likely, could I quite answer for myself. Well, I thought I could. After last night, I thought I could. But to wait and wait and expect and think was such bad preparation that I resolved to go along the road again and meet her. So I said to Charley, "Charley, I will go by myself and walk along the road until she comes." Charley highly approving of anything that pleased me, I went and left her at home. But before I got to the second milestone, I had been in so many palpitations from seeing dust in the distance, though I knew it was not, and could not, be the coach yet, that I resolved to turn back and go home again. And when I had turned, I was in such fear of the coach coming up behind me, though I still knew that it neither would nor could do any such thing, that I ran the greater part of the way to avoid being overtaken. Then I considered, when I had got safe back again, this was a nice thing to have done. Now I was hot and had made the worst of it instead of the best. At last, when I believed there was at least 1/4 more yet, Charley all at once cried out to me as I was trembling in the garden, "Here she comes, miss! Here she is!" I did not mean to do it, but I ran upstairs into my room and hid myself behind the door. There I stood trembling, even when I heard my darling calling as she came upstairs, "Esther, my dear, my love, where are you? Little woman, dear Dame Durden!" She ran in, and was running out again when she saw me. Ah, my angel girl! The old dear look, all love, all fondness, all affection, nothing else in it, no, nothing, nothing. Oh, how happy I was, down upon the floor, with my sweet, beautiful girl down upon the floor too, holding my scarred face to her lovely cheek, bathing it with tears and kisses, rocking me to and fro like a child, calling me by every tender name that she could think of, and pressing me to her faithful heart.
End of chapter 36.